Now, on this, I'm going to admit to being a little lazy, simply because I can't be arsed to needlessly deep dive into something that is so strongly still in living memory, and that is the Iraq weapons of mass destruction. With the Iraq WMD evidence, there are several defectors who attested to the existence of such weapons. This included some who lacked the specialized knowledge to really know what the Iraq military really had, but it also included some people who did know. Now, were these individuals brought forward who did have supposedly the requisite knowledge? Were they deliberately lying? That's something I don't really care about. A lot of people ask. It's not something I think anyone can answer, and it's not really important, because all that matters going forward or going backward is that a great compendium of experts and intelligence officials got it wrong. And what I'm going to do, and this is why I'm saying this is kind of lazy, but I don't think you can really top Colin Powell's speech to the UN. This is the authority blast, and I'm just going to play it in kind of a modified way, and I'll have it time-stamped so you can skip it.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, distinguished colleagues, I would like to begin by expressing my thanks for the special effort that each of you made to be here today. This is an important day for us all as we review the situation with respect to Iraq and its disarmament obligations under UN Security Council Resolution 1441. Last November 8th, this Council passed Resolution 1441 by a unanimous vote. The purpose of that resolution was to disarm Iraq of its weapons of mass destruction. Iraq had already been found guilty of material breach of its obligations, stretching back over 16 previous resolutions and 12 years. Resolution 1441 was not dealing with an innocent party, but a regime this Council has repeatedly convicted over the years. Resolution 1441 gave Iraq one last chance to come into compliance or to face serious consequences. And to assist in its disarmament, we called on Iraq to cooperate with returning inspectors from UNMOVIC and IAEA. We laid down tough standards for Iraq to meet to allow the inspectors to do their job. This Council placed the burden on Iraq to comply and disarm, and not on the inspectors to find that which Iraq has gone out of its way to conceal for so long. Inspectors are inspectors. They are not detectives. I asked for this session today for two purposes. First, to support the core assessments made by Dr. Blix and Dr. El-Baradei. As Dr. Blix reported to this Council on January 27th, quote, Iraq appears not to have come to a genuine acceptance, not even today, of the disarmament which was demanded of it. And as Dr. El-Baradei reported, Iraq's declaration of December 7th, quote, did not provide any new information relevant to certain questions that have been outstanding since 1998. My second purpose today is to provide you with additional information, to share with you what the United States knows about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, as well as Iraq's involvement in terrorism, which is also the subject of Resolution 1441 and other earlier resolutions. I might add at this point that we are providing all relevant information we can to the inspection teams for them to do their work. The material I will present to you comes from a variety of sources. Some are U.S. sources and some are those of other countries. Some of the sources are technical, such as intercepted telephone conversations and photos taken by satellites. Other sources are people who have risked their lives to let the world know what Saddam Hussein is really up to. I cannot tell you everything that we know, but what I can share with you, when combined with what all of us have learned over the years, is deeply troubling. What you will see is an accumulation of facts and disturbing patterns of behavior. The facts in Iraq's behavior demonstrate that Saddam Hussein and his regime have made no effort to disarm as required by the international community. Indeed, the facts and Iraq's behavior show that Saddam Hussein and his regime are concealing their efforts to produce more weapons of mass destruction. Let me begin by playing a tape for you. What you're about to hear is a conversation that my government monitored. It takes place on November 26th of last year, on the day before United Nations teams resumed inspections in Iraq. The conversation involves two senior officers, a colonel and a brigadier general from Iraq's elite military unit, the Republican Guard. Let me pause and review some of the key elements of this conversation that you just heard between these two officers. First, they acknowledge that our colleague Mohammed al-Baradei is coming, and they know what he's coming for, and they know he's coming the next day. He's coming to look for things that are prohibited. He is expecting these gentlemen to cooperate with him and not hide things. But they're worried. We have this modified vehicle. What do we say if one of them sees it? What is their concern? Their concern is that it's something they should not have, something that should not be seen. The general is incredulous. You didn't get a modified. You don't have one of those, do you? I have one. Which? From where? From the workshop. From the Al-Kindi company. What? From Al-Kindi. I'll come to see you in the morning. I'm worried you all have something left. We evacuated everything. We don't have anything left. Nobody says. We evacuated everything. We didn't destroy it. We didn't line it up for inspection. We didn't turn it into the inspectors. We evacuated it to make sure it was not around when the inspectors showed up. I will come to you tomorrow. The Al-Kindi company. This is a company that is well known to have been involved in prohibited weapon systems activity. Let me play another tape for you. As you'll recall, the inspectors found 12 empty chemical warheads on January 16th. On January 20th, 4 days later, Iraq promised the inspectors it would search for more. You will now hear an officer from Republican Guard headquarters issuing an instruction to an officer in the field. Their conversation took place just last week on January 30th. Let me pause again and review the elements of this message. They're inspecting the ammunition you have. Yes, yes. For the possibility there are forbidden ammo. For the possibility there is by chance forbidden ammo? Yes. And we sent you a message yesterday to clean out all of the areas, the scrap areas, the abandoned areas, make sure there is nothing there. Remember the first message, evacuate it. This is all part of a system of hiding things and moving things out of the way and making sure they have left nothing behind. You go a little further into this message and you see the specific instructions from headquarters. After you have carried out what is contained in this message, destroy the message, because I don't want anyone to see this message. Okay. Why? This message would have verified to the inspectors that they have been trying to turn over things. They were looking for things, but they don't want that message seen because they were trying to clean up the area, to leave no evidence behind of the presence of weapons of mass destruction. And they can claim that nothing was there, and the inspectors can look all they want, and they will find nothing. This effort to hide things from the inspectors is not one or two isolated events. Quite the contrary. This is part and parcel of a policy of evasion and deception that goes back 12 years, a policy set at the highest levels of the Iraqi regime. We know that Saddam Hussein has what is called, quote, a higher committee for monitoring the inspection teams, unquote. Think about that. Iraq has a high-level committee to monitor the inspectors who were sent in to monitor Iraq's disarmament. Not to cooperate with them, not to assist them, but to spy on them and keep them from doing their jobs. The committee reports directly to Saddam Hussein. It is headed by Iraq's Vice President, Taha Yassin Ramadan. Its members include Saddam Hussein's son, Qusay. This committee also includes Lieutenant General Amir al-Sadi, an advisor to Saddam. In case that name isn't immediately familiar to you, General Sadi has been the Iraqi regime's primary point of contact for Dr. Blix and Dr. al-Baradei. It was General Sadi who last fall publicly pledged that Iraq was prepared to cooperate unconditionally with inspectors. Quite the contrary, Sadi's job is not to cooperate. It is to deceive, not to disarm, but to undermine the inspectors, not to support them, but to frustrate them, and to make sure they learn nothing. We have learned a lot about the work of this special committee. We learned that just prior to the return of inspectors last November, the regime had decided to resume what we heard called the old game of cat and mouse, unquote. For example, let me focus on the now famous declaration that Iraq submitted to this council on December 7th. Iraq never had any intention of complying with this council's mandate. Instead, Iraq planned to use the declaration to overwhelm us and to overwhelm the inspectors with useless information about Iraq's permitted weapons so that we would not have time to pursue Iraq's prohibited weapons. Iraq's goal was to give us in this room, to give those of us on this council, the false impression that the inspection process was working. You saw the result. Dr. Blix pronounced the 12,200-page declaration rich in volume, poor in information, and practically devoid of new evidence. Could any member of this council honestly rise in defense of this false declaration? Everything we have seen and heard indicates that instead of cooperating actively with the inspectors to ensure the success of their mission, Saddam Hussein and his regime are busy doing all they possibly can to ensure that inspectors succeed in finding absolutely nothing. My colleagues, every statement I make today is backed up by sources, solid sources. These are not assertions. What we're giving you are facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence. I will cite some examples, and these are from human sources. Orders were issued to Iraq security organizations as well as to Saddam Hussein's own office to hide all correspondence with the Organization of Military Industrialization. This is the organization that oversees Iraq's weapons of mass destruction activities. Make sure there are no documents left which would connect you to the OMI. We know that Saddam's son Qusay ordered the removal of all prohibited weapons from Saddam's numerous palace complexes. We know that Iraqi government officials, members of the ruling Ba'ath Party, and scientists have hidden prohibited items in their homes. Other key files from military and scientific establishments have been placed in cars that are being driven around the countryside by Iraqi intelligence agents to avoid detection. Thanks to intelligence they were provided, the inspectors recently found dramatic confirmation of these reports. When they searched the home of an Iraqi nuclear scientist, they uncovered roughly 2,000 pages of documents. You see them here being brought out of the home and placed in UN hands. Some of the material is classified and related to Iraq's nuclear program. Tell me, answer me, are the inspectors to search the house of every government official, every Ba'ath Party member, and every scientist in the country to find the truth, to get the information they need to satisfy the demands of our council? Our sources tell us that in some cases, the hard drives of computers at Iraqi weapons facilities were replaced. Who took the hard drives? Where did they go? What's being hidden? Why? There's only one answer to the why. To deceive, to hide, keep from the inspector. Numerous human sources tell us that the Iraqis are moving not just documents and hard drives, but weapons of mass destruction to keep them from being found by inspectors. While we were here in this council chamber debating Resolution 1441 last fall, we know from sources that a missile brigade outside Baghdad was dispersing rocket launchers and warheads containing biological warfare agent to various locations, distributing them to various locations in western Iraq. Most of the launchers and warheads had been hidden in large groves of palm trees and were to be moved every 1 to 4 weeks to escape detection. We also have satellite photos that indicate that banned materials have recently been moved from a number of Iraqi weapons of mass destruction facilities. Let me say a word about satellite images before I show a couple. Photos that I am about to show you are sometimes hard for the average person to interpret, hard for me. The painstaking work of photo analysis takes experts with years and years of experience, poring for hours and hours over light tables. But as I show you these images, I will try to capture and explain what they mean, what they indicate to our imagery specialists. Let's look at one. This one is about a weapons munition facility, a facility that holds ammunition at a place called Taji. This is one of about 65 such facilities in Iraq. We know that this one has housed chemical munitions. In fact, this is where the Iraqis recently came up with the additional 4 chemical weapon shells. Here you see 15 munitions bunkers in yellow and red outlines. The 4 that are in red squares represent active chemical munitions bunkers. How do I know that? How can I say that? Let me give you a closer look. Look at the image on the left. On the left is a close-up of one of the 4 chemical bunkers. The 2 arrows indicate the presence of sure signs that the bunkers are storing chemical munitions. The arrow at the top that says security points to a facility that is a signature item for this kind of bunker. Inside that facility are special guards and special equipment to monitor any leakage that might come out of the bunker. The truck you also see is a signature item. It's a decontamination vehicle in case something goes wrong. This is characteristic of those 4 bunkers. The special security facility and the decontamination vehicle will be in the area, if not at any one of them or one of the other. It is moving around those 4, and it moves as it needed to move as people are working in the different bunkers. Now look at the picture on the right. You are now looking at 2 of those sanitized bunkers. The signature vehicles are gone. The tents are gone. It's been cleaned up, and it was done on the 22nd of December as the UN inspection team is arriving, and you can see the inspection vehicles arriving in the lower portion of the picture on the right. The bunkers are clean when the inspectors get there. They found nothing. This sequence of events raises the worrisome suspicion that Iraq had been tipped off to the forthcoming inspections at Taji. As it did throughout the 1990s, we know that Iraq today is actively using its considerable intelligence capabilities to hide its illicit activities. From our sources, we know that inspectors are under constant surveillance by an army of Iraqi intelligence operatives. Iraq is relentlessly attempting to tap all of their communications, both voice and electronics. I would call my colleagues' attention to the fine paper that the United Kingdom distributed yesterday, which describes in exquisite detail Iraqi deception activities. In this next example, you will see the type of concealment activity Iraq has undertaken in response to the resumption of inspections. Indeed, in November 2002, just when the inspections were about to resume, this type of activity spiked. Here are 3 examples. At this ballistic missile site on November 10th, we saw a cargo truck preparing to move ballistic missile components. At this biological weapons-related facility on November 25th, just 2 days before inspections resumed, this truck caravan appeared, something we almost never see at this facility, and we monitor it carefully and regularly. At this ballistic missile facility, again, 2 days before inspections began, 5 large cargo trucks appeared, along with the truck-mounted crane to move missiles. We saw this kind of house cleaning at close to 30 sites. Days after this activity, the vehicles and the equipment that I've just highlighted disappear, and the site returns to patterns of normalcy. We don't know precisely what Iraq was moving, but the inspectors already knew about these sites, so Iraq knew that they would be coming. We must ask ourselves, why would Iraq suddenly move equipment of this nature before inspections if they were anxious to demonstrate what they had or did not have? Remember the first intercept in which 2 Iraqis talked about the need to hide a modified vehicle from the inspectors. Where did Iraq take all of this equipment? Why wasn't it presented to the inspectors? Iraq also has refused to permit any U-2 reconnaissance flights that would give the inspectors a better sense of what's being moved before, during, and after inspections. This refusal to allow this kind of reconnaissance is in direct, specific violation of operative paragraph 7 of our resolution 1441. Saddam Hussein and his regime are not just trying to conceal weapons, they're also trying to hide people. You know the basic facts. Iraq has not complied with its obligation to allow immediate, unimpeded, unrestricted, and private access to all officials and other persons as required by resolution 1441. The regime only allows interviews with inspectors in the presence of an Iraqi official, a minder. The official Iraqi organization charged with facilitating inspections announced publicly and announced ominously that, quote, nobody is ready to leave Iraq to be interviewed. Iraqi Vice President Ramadan accused the inspectors of conducting espionage, a veiled threat that anyone cooperating with UN inspectors was committing treason. Iraq did not meet its obligations under 1441 to provide a comprehensive list of scientists associated with its weapons of mass destruction programs. Iraq's list was out of date. It contained only about 500 names, despite the fact that UNSCOM had earlier put together a list of about 3,500 names. Let me just tell you what a number of human sources have told us. Saddam Hussein has directly participated in the effort to prevent interviews. In early December, Saddam Hussein had all Iraqi scientists warned of the serious consequences that they and their families would face if they revealed any sensitive information to the inspectors. They were forced to sign documents acknowledging that divulging information is punishable by death. Saddam Hussein also said that scientists should be told not to agree to leave Iraq. Anyone who agreed to be interviewed outside Iraq would be treated as a spy. This violates 1441. In mid-November, just before the inspectors returned, Iraqi experts were ordered to report to the headquarters of the Special Security Organization to receive counterintelligence training. The training focused on evasion methods, interrogation resistance techniques, and how to mislead inspectors. Ladies and gentlemen, these are not assertions. These are facts corroborated by many sources, some of them sources of the intelligence services of other countries. For example, in mid-December, weapons experts at one facility were replaced by Iraqi intelligence agents who were to deceive inspectors about the work that was being done there. On orders from Saddam Hussein, Iraqi officials issued a false death certificate for one scientist, and he was sent into hiding. In the middle of January, experts at one facility that was related to weapons of mass destruction, those experts had been ordered to stay home from work to avoid the inspectors. Workers from other Iraqi military facilities not engaged in illicit weapons projects were to replace the workers who've been sent home. A dozen experts have been placed under house arrest, not in their own houses, but as a group at one of Saddam Hussein's guest houses. It goes on and on and on. As the examples I have just presented show, the information and intelligence we have gathered point to an active and systematic effort on the part of the Iraqi regime to keep key materials and people from the inspectors in direct violation of Resolution 1441. The pattern is not just one of reluctant cooperation, nor is it merely a lack of cooperation. What we see is a deliberate campaign to prevent any meaningful inspection work. My colleagues, operative paragraph 4 of UN Resolution 1441, which we lingered over so long last fall, clearly states that false statements and omissions in the declaration and a failure by Iraq at any time to comply with and cooperate fully in the implementation of this resolution shall constitute, the facts speak for themselves, shall constitute further material breach of its obligation. We wrote it this way to give Iraq an early test. To give Iraq an early test. Would they give an honest declaration, and would they early on indicate a willingness to cooperate with the inspector? It was designed to be an early test. They failed that test. By this standard of this operative paragraph, I believe that Iraq is now in further material breach of its obligations. I believe this conclusion is irrefutable and undeniable. Iraq has now placed itself in danger of the serious consequences called for in UN Resolution 1441. And this body places itself in danger of irrelevance that allows Iraq to continue to defy its will without responding effectively and immediately. The issue before us is not how much time we are willing to give the inspectors to be frustrated by Iraqi obstruction, but how much longer are we willing to put up with Iraq's noncompliance before we as a council, we as the United Nations say, enough, enough. The gravity of this moment is matched by the gravity of the threat that Iraq's weapons of mass destruction pose to the world. Let me now turn to those deadly weapons programs and describe why they are real and present dangers to the region and to the world. First, biological weapons. We have talked frequently here about biological weapons. By way of introduction and history, I think there are just 3 quick points I need to make. First, you will recall that it took UNSCOM 4 long and frustrating years to pry an admission out of Iraq that it had biological weapons. Second, when Iraq finally admitted having these weapons in 1995, the quantities were vast. Less than a teaspoon of dry anthrax, a little bit about this amount. This is just about the amount of a teaspoon. Less than a teaspoonful of dry anthrax in an envelope shut down the United States Senate in the fall of 2001. This forced several hundred people to undergo emergency medical treatment and killed 2 postal workers, just from an amount just about this quantity that was inside of an envelope. Iraq declared 8,500 liters of anthrax, but UNSCOM estimates that Saddam Hussein could have produced 25,000 liters. If concentrated into this dry form, this amount would be enough to fill tens upon tens, about tens of thousands of teaspoons. And Saddam Hussein has not verifiably accounted for even 1 teaspoonful of this deadly material. And that is my third point, and it is key. The Iraqis have never accounted for all of the biological weapons they admitted they had, and we know they had. They have never accounted for all the organic material used to make them, and they have not accounted for many of the weapons filled with these agents, such as their R-400 bombs. This is evidence, not conjecture. This is true. This is all well documented. Dr. Blix told this council that Iraq has provided little evidence to verify anthrax production and no convincing evidence of its destruction. It should come as no shock, then, that since Saddam Hussein forced out the last inspectors in 1998, we have amassed much intelligence indicating that Iraq is continuing to make these weapons. One of the most worrisome things that emerges from the thick intelligence file we have on Iraq's biological weapons is the existence of mobile production facilities used to make biological agents. Let me take you inside that intelligence file and share with you what we know from eyewitness accounts. We have first-hand descriptions of biological weapons factories on wheels and on rails. The trucks and train cars are easily moved and are designed to evade detection by inspectors. In a matter of months, they can produce a quantity of biological poison equal to the entire amount that Iraq claimed to have produced in the years prior to the Gulf War. Although Iraq's mobile production program began in the mid-1990s, UN inspectors at the time only had vague hints of such programs. Confirmation came later, in the year 2000. The source was an eyewitness, an Iraqi chemical engineer who supervised one of these facilities. He actually was present during biological agent production runs. He was also at the site when an accident occurred in 1998. 12 technicians died from exposure to biological agents. He reported that when UNSCOM was in country and inspecting, the biological weapons agent production always began on Thursdays at midnight because Iraq thought UNSCOM would not inspect on the Muslim holy day, Thursday night through Friday. He added that this was important because the units could not be broken down in the middle of a production run, which had to be completed by Friday evening before the inspectors might arrive again. This defector is currently hiding in another country with a certain knowledge that Saddam Hussein will kill him if he finds him. His eyewitness account of these mobile production facilities has been corroborated by other sources. A second source, an Iraqi civil engineer in a position to know the details of the program, confirmed the existence of transportable facilities moving on trailers. A third source, also in a position to know, reported in summer 2002 that Iraq had manufactured mobile production systems mounted on road trailer units and on rail cars. Finally, a fourth source, an Iraqi major who defected, confirmed that Iraq has mobile biological research laboratories in addition to the production facilities I mentioned earlier. We have diagrammed what our sources reported about these mobile facilities. Here you see both truck and rail car mounted mobile factories. The description our sources gave us of the technical features required by such facilities are highly detailed and extremely accurate. As these drawings, based on their description, show, we know what the fermenters look like. We know what the tanks, pumps, compressors, and other parts look like. We know how they fit together. We know how they work. And we know a great deal about the platforms on which they are mounted. As shown in this diagram, these factories can be concealed easily, either by moving ordinary-looking trucks and rail cars along Iraq's thousands of miles of highway or track, or by parking them in a garage or a warehouse or somewhere in Iraq's extensive system of underground tunnels and bunkers. We know that Iraq has at least 7 of these mobile biological agent factories. The truck-mounted ones have at least 2 or 3 trucks each. That means that the mobile production facilities are very few. Perhaps 18 trucks that we know of. There may be more, but perhaps 18 that we know of. Just imagine trying to find 18 trucks among the thousands and thousands of trucks that travel the roads of Iraq every single day. It took the inspectors 4 years to find out that Iraq was making biological agents. How long do you think it will take the inspectors to find even one of these 18 trucks without Iraq coming forward, as they are supposed to, with the information about these kinds of capabilities? Ladies and gentlemen, these are sophisticated facilities. For example, they can produce anthrax and botulinum toxin. In fact, they can produce enough dry biological agent in a single month to kill thousands upon thousands of people. And dry agent of this type is the most lethal form for human beings. By 1998, UN experts agreed that the Iraqis had perfected drying techniques for their biological weapons programs. Now, Iraq has incorporated this drying expertise into these mobile production facilities. We know from Iraq's past admissions that it has successfully weaponized not only anthrax, but also other biological agents, including botulinum toxin, aflatoxin, and ricin. But Iraq's research efforts did not stop there. Saddam Hussein has investigated dozens of biological agents, causing diseases such as gas gangrene, plague, typhus, tetanus, cholera, camelpox, and and hemorrhagic fever, and he also has the wherewithal to develop smallpox. The Iraqi regime has also developed ways to disperse lethal biological agents widely, indiscriminately, into the water supply, into the air. For example, Iraq had a program to modify aerial fuel tanks for Mirage jets. This video of an Iraqi test flight obtained by UNSCOM some years ago shows an Iraqi F-1 Mirage jet aircraft. Note the spray coming from beneath the Mirage. That is 2,000 liters of simulated anthrax that a jet is spraying. In 1995, an Iraqi military officer, Mujahid Saleh Abdul Latif, told inspectors that Iraq intended the spray tanks to be mounted onto a MiG-21 that had been converted into an unmanned aerial vehicle, or a UAV. UAVs outfitted with spray tanks constitute an ideal method for launching a terrorist attack using biological weapons. Iraq admitted to producing 4 spray tanks, but to this day, it has provided no credible evidence that they were destroyed, evidence that was required by the international community. There can be no doubt that Saddam Hussein has biological weapons and the capability to rapidly produce more, many more. And he has the ability to dispense these lethal poisons and diseases in ways that can cause massive death and destruction. If biological weapons seem too terrible to contemplate, chemical weapons are equally chilling. Unmovic already laid out much of this, and it is documented for all of us to read in UNSCOM's 1999 report on the subject. Let me set the stage with 3 key points that all of us need to keep in mind. First, Saddam Hussein has used these horrific weapons on another country and on his own people. In fact, in the history of chemical warfare, no country has had more battlefield experience with chemical weapons since World War I than Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Second, as with biological weapons, Saddam Hussein has never accounted for vast amounts of chemical weaponry. 550 artillery shells with mustard, 30,000 empty munitions, and enough precursors to increase his stockpile to as much as 500 tons of chemical agents. If we consider just one category of missing weaponry, 6,500 bombs from the Iran-Iraq War, Unmovic says the amount of chemical agent in them would be on the order of 1,000 tons. These quantities of chemical weapons are now unaccounted for. Dr. Blick says, quipped that, quote, mustard gas is not marmalade. You are supposed to know what you did with it. We believe Saddam Hussein knows what he did with it, and he has not come clean with the international community. We have evidence these weapons existed. What we don't have is evidence from Iraq that they have been destroyed or where they are. That is what we are still waiting for. Third point, Iraq's record on chemical weapons is replete with lies. It took years for Iraq to finally admit that it had produced 4 tons of the deadly nerve agent VX. A single drop of VX on the skin will kill in minutes. 4 tons. The admission only came out after inspectors collected documentation as a result of the defection of Hussein Kamal, Saddam Hussein's late son-in-law. UNSCOM also gained forensic evidence that Iraq had produced VX and put it into weapons for delivery. Yet to this day, Iraq denies it had ever weaponized VX. And on January 10, 27, Unmovic told this council that it has information that conflicts with the Iraqi account of its VX program. We know that Iraq has embedded key portions of its illicit chemical weapons infrastructure within its legitimate civilian industry. To all outward appearances, even to experts, the infrastructure looks like an ordinary civilian operation. Illicit and legitimate production can go on simultaneously, or on a dime. This dual-use infrastructure can turn from clandestine to commercial and then back again. These inspections would be unlikely. Any inspections of such facilities would be unlikely to turn up anything prohibited, especially if there is any warning that the inspections are coming. Call it ingenious or evil genius, but the Iraqis deliberately designed their chemical weapons programs to be inspected. It is infrastructure with a built-in ally. Under the guise of dual-use infrastructure, Iraq has undertaken an effort to reconstitute facilities that were closely associated with its past program to develop and produce chemical weapons. For example, Iraq has rebuilt key portions of the Tact state establishment. TARIC includes facilities designed specifically for Iraq's chemical weapons program and employs key figures from past programs. That's the production end of Saddam's chemical weapons business. What about the delivery end? I'm going to show you a small part of a chemical complex called Al-Musayyib, a site that Iraq has used for at least 3 years to transship chemical weapons from production facilities out to the field. In May 2002, our satellites photographed the unusual activity in this picture. Here we see cargo vehicles are again at this transshipment point, and we can see that they are accompanied by a decontamination vehicle associated with biological or chemical weapons activity. What makes this picture significant is that we have a human source who has corroborated that movement of chemical weapons occurred at this site at that time. So it's not just the photo, and it's not an individual seeing the photo. It's the photo and then the knowledge of an individual being brought together to make the case. This photograph of the site, taken 2 months later in July, shows not only the previous site, which is the figure in the middle at the top with the bulldozer sign near it. It shows that this previous site, as well as all of the other sites around the site, have been fully bulldozed and graded. The topsoil has been removed. The Iraqis literally removed the crust of the earth from large portions of this site in order to conceal chemical weapons evidence that would be there from years of chemical weapons activity. To support its deadly biological and chemical weapons programs, Iraq procures needed items from around the world using an extensive clandestine network. What we know comes largely from intercepted communications and human sources who are in a position to know the facts. Iraq's procurement efforts include equipment that can filter and separate microorganisms and toxins involved in biological weapons, equipment that can be used to concentrate the agent, growth media that can be used to continue producing anthrax and botulinum toxin, sterilization equipment for laboratories, glass-lined reactors and specialty pumps that can handle corrosive chemical weapons agents and precursors, large amounts of thionyl chloride, a precursor for nerve and blister agents, and other chemicals such as sodium sulfide, an important mustard agent precursor. Now, of course, Iraq will argue that these items can also be used for legitimate purposes. But if that is true, why do we have to learn about them by intercepting communications and risking the lives of human agents? With Iraq's well-documented history on biological and chemical weapons, why should any of us give Iraq the benefit of the doubt? I don't, and I don't think you will either after you hear this next intercept. Just a few weeks ago, we intercepted communications between two commanders in Iraq's 2nd Republican Guard Corps. One commander is going to be giving an instruction to the other. You will hear as this unfolds that what he wants to communicate to the other guy, he wants to make sure the other guy hears clearly, to the point of repeating it so that it gets written down and completely understood. Listen.
Hello. Hello. Hello.
Let's review a few selected items of this conversation. Two officers talking to each other on the radio want to make sure nothing is misunderstood. Remove. The expression, I got it. Nerve agents. Wherever it comes up, got it. Wherever it comes up. In the wireless instructions, in the instructions. Correction, no, in the wireless instructions. Wireless, I got it. Why does he repeat it that way? Why is he so forceful in making sure this is understood? And why did he focus on wireless instructions? Because the senior officer is concerned that somebody might be listening. Well, somebody was. Nerve agents. Stop talking about it. They're listening to us. Don't give any evidence that we have these horrible agents. But we know that they do, and this kind of conversation confirms it. Our conservative estimate is that Iraq today has a stockpile of between 100 and 500 tons of chemical weapons agent. That is enough agent to fill 16,000 battlefield rockets. Even the low end of 100 tons of agent would enable Saddam Hussein to cause mass casualties across more than 100 square miles of territory, an area nearly 5 times the size of Manhattan. Let me remind you that of the 122-millimeter chemical warheads that the UN inspectors found recently, this discovery could very well be, as has been noted, the tip of a submerged iceberg. The question before us all, my friends, is when will we see the rest of the submerged iceberg? Saddam Hussein has chemical weapons. Saddam Hussein has used such weapons. And Saddam Hussein has no compunction about using them again against his neighbors and against his own people. And we have sources who tell us that he recently has authorized his field commanders to use them. He wouldn't be passing out the orders if he didn't have the weapon or the intent to use them. We also have sources who tell us that since the 1980s, Saddam's regime has been experimenting on human beings to perfect its biological or chemical weapons. A source said that 1,600 death row prisoners were transferred in 1995 to a special unit for such experiments. An eyewitness saw prisoners tied down to beds, experiments conducted on them, blood oozing around the victims' mouths, and autopsies performed to confirm the effects of the prisoners on the prisoner. Saddam Hussein's inhumanity has no limits. Let me turn now to nuclear weapons. We have no indication that Saddam Hussein has ever abandoned his nuclear weapons program. On the contrary, we have more than a decade of proof that he remains determined to acquire nuclear weapons. To fully appreciate the challenge that we face today, remember that in 1991, the inspectors searched Iraq's primary nuclear weapons facilities for the first time, and they found nothing to conclude that Iraq had a nuclear weapons program. But based on defector information in May of 1991, Saddam Hussein's lie was exposed. In truth, Saddam Hussein had a massive clandestine nuclear weapons program that covered several different techniques to enrich uranium, including electromagnetic isotope separation, gas centrifuge, and gas diffusion. We estimate that this illicit program cost the Iraqis several $billion. Nonetheless, Iraq continued to tell the IAEA that it had no nuclear weapons program. If Saddam had not been stopped, Iraq could have produced a nuclear bomb by 1993, years earlier than most worst-case assessments that had been made before the war. In 1995, as a result of another defector, we find out that after his invasion of Kuwait, Saddam Hussein had initiated a crash program to build a crude nuclear weapon in violation of Iraq's UN obligations. Saddam Hussein already possesses 2 out of the 3 key components needed to build a nuclear bomb. He has a cadre of nuclear scientists with the expertise, and he has a bomb design. Since 1998, his efforts to reconstitute his nuclear program have been focused on acquiring the third and last component, sufficient fissile material to produce a nuclear explosion. To make the fissile material, he needs to develop an ability to enrich uranium. Saddam Hussein is determined to get his hands on a nuclear bomb. He is so determined that he has made repeated covert attempts to acquire high-specification aluminum tubes from 11 different countries, even after inspections resumed. These tubes are controlled by the nuclear suppliers group precisely because they can be used as centrifuges for enriching uranium. By now, just about everyone has heard of these tubes, and we all know that there are differences of opinion. There is controversy about what these tubes are for. Most U.S. experts think they are intended to serve as rotors in centrifuges used to enrich uranium. Other experts and the Iraqis themselves argue that they are really to produce the rocket bodies for a conventional weapon, a multiple rocket launcher. Let me tell you what is not controversial about these tubes. First, all the experts who have analyzed the tubes in our possession agree that they can be adapted for centrifuge use. Second, Iraq had no business buying them for any purpose. They are banned for Iraq. I am no expert on centrifuge tubes, but just as an old Army trooper, I can tell you a couple of things. First, it strikes me as quite odd that these tubes are manufactured to a tolerance that far exceeds U.S. requirements for comparable rockets. Maybe the Iraqis just manufacture their conventional weapons to a higher standard than we do, but I don't think so. Second, we actually have examined tubes from several different batches that were seized clandestinely before they reached Baghdad. What we notice in these different batches is a progression to higher and higher levels of specification, including in the latest batch, an anodized coating on extremely smooth inner and outer surfaces. Why would they continue refining the specification? Why would they continue refining the specification? Go to all that trouble for something that, if it was a rocket, would soon be blown into shrapnel when it went off. The high-tolerance aluminum tubes are only part of the story. We also have intelligence from multiple sources that Iraq is attempting to acquire magnets and high-speed balancing machines. Both items can be used in a gas centrifuge program to enrich uranium. In 1999 and 2000, Iraqi officials negotiated with firms in Romania, India, Russia, and Slovenia for the purchase of a magnet production plant. Iraq wanted the plant to produce magnets weighing 20 to 30 grams. That's the same weight as the magnets used in Iraq's gas centrifuge program before the Gulf War. This incident, linked with the tubes, is another indicator of Iraq's attempt to reconstitute its nuclear weapons program. Intercepted communications from mid-2000 through last summer show that Iraq front companies sought to buy machines that can be used to balance gas centrifuge rotors. One of these companies also had been involved in a failed effort in 2001 to smuggle aluminum tubes into Iraq. People will continue to debate this issue, but there is no doubt in my mind these illicit procurement efforts show that Saddam Hussein is very much focused on putting in place key missing piece from his nuclear weapons program, the ability to produce fissile material. He also has been busy trying to maintain the other key parts of his nuclear program, particularly his cadre of key nuclear scientists. It is noteworthy that over the last 18 months, Saddam Hussein has paid increasing personal attention to Iraqi's top nuclear scientists, a group that the government-controlled press calls openly his nuclear mujahideen. He regularly exhorts them and praises their progress. Progress towards what end? Long ago, the Security Council, this council, required Iraq to halt all nuclear activities of any kind. Let me talk now about the systems Iraq is developing to deliver weapons of mass destruction, in particular Iraq's ballistic missiles and unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs. First, missiles. We all remember that before the Gulf War, Saddam Hussein's goal was missiles that flew not just hundreds, but thousands of kilometers. He wanted to strike not only his neighbors, but also nations far beyond his borders. While inspectors destroyed most of the prohibited ballistic missiles, numerous intelligence reports over the past decade from sources inside Iraq indicate that Saddam Hussein retains a covert force of up to a few dozen Scud variant ballistic missiles. These are missiles with a range of 650 to 900 kilometers. We know from intelligence and Iraq's own admissions that Iraq's alleged permitted ballistic missiles, the Al-Samud 2 and the Al-Fatah, violate the 150-kilometer limit established by this council in Resolution 687. These are prohibited systems. UNMOVIC has also reported that Iraq has illegally imported 380 SA-2 rocket engines. These are likely for use in the Al-Samud 2. Their import was illegal on 3 counts. Resolution 687 prohibited all military shipments into Iraq. UNSCOM specifically prohibited use of these engines in surface-to-surface missiles. And finally, as we have just noted, they are for a system that exceeds the 150-kilometer range limit. Worst of all, some of these engines were acquired as late as December, after this council passed Resolution 1441. What I want you to know today is that Iraq has programs that are intended to produce ballistic missiles that fly over 1,000 kilometers. One program is pursuing a liquid fuel missile that would be able to fly more than 1,200 kilometers. And you can see from this map, as well as I can, who will be in danger of these missiles. As part of this effort, another little piece of evidence, Iraq has built an engine test stand that is larger than anything it has ever had. Notice the dramatic difference in size between the test stand on the left, the old one, and the new one on the right. Note the large exhaust vent. This is where the flame from the engine comes out. The exhaust vent on the right test stand is 5 times longer than the one on the left. The one on the left was used for short-range missiles. The one on the right is clearly intended for long-range missiles.
Now, this is actually a very, very important speech. Say you're a guy who's made up his mind that there were not WMDs in Iraq back in 2003, and you wanted to try to argue against Powell on this. Okay, where would you even begin? The intelligence agencies have all the archives, and they have people whose full-time job it is to assemble evidence specifically in favor of Iraq having WMDs. To expect amateurs to be able to counter all of these specific things is nuts. This is what I term a funhouse, and the Iraq WMD narrative is a funhouse. And you don't deal with funhouses by going inside them. So here's kind of the basic idea of a funhouse. Say you have 2 guys who are in a deadlift competition. One guy physically lifts 200 kilograms and the other physically lifts 220 kilograms. I don't know if that's a lot, but the point is one lifts more than the other. Okay, so we see the weights, and clearly the guy who lifted 220 kilograms lifted more. Right? Like he exerted more force to lift that bar. Well, not so fast. One of the judges was able somehow to specifically measure the contractive force of every single muscle fiber in the bodies of both of the lifters. And he found that the lifter who lifted 200 kilograms actually had more contractile force for 6 million muscle fibers. And the one who lifted 200 kilograms also had more total muscle fibers overall than the one who lifted 220 kilograms. And if you want to say that the lifter who lifted more actually lifted more, well, then you need to respond to each claim about each specific muscle fiber. Right? That's real rigorous research. That's going through all the arguments. Right? That's rigor. That's what you need to do if you're going to be responsible and you want to make such a claim that the guy who lifted 220 kilograms actually lifted more. So this judge made a funhouse, and he wants you to go through it. No big picture, no good faith attempt to try to figure things out, no going into detail on things when you really need to know, right? No big simples, just endless minutiae grinding. And out there in the world, there's an infinity of facts. You can assemble and construct a narrative for whatever you want, create a funhouse for whatever you want, and just do minutiae grinding. The fallout from Iraq not having WMDs was fairly devastating for the neoconservatives movement, as it's called, though perhaps not as devastating as it should have been. A lot of them have been able to hide, change their stripes, and continue with their Dr. Strangelove ways. There were and still are bitter clingers who say Saddam destroyed the weapons, destroyed the documentation, shipped them to Syria, and they'll cite that some weapons ostensibly used by Assad were similar to those supposedly in Iraq. There's no way you can argue against that. When a narrative is institutionally embedded, that is, it becomes part of sort of the idea nexus, the orthodoxy, what everyone believes, then one, there will be more volume of argument in favor of that narrative than against it. This is simply a matter of resources both for fact-finding and writing up what you might call fact checks or debunkings, right? There's simply more resources for things that are within the institutional nexus than ideas that are not. Consider, was any of the stuff in Powell's speech debunked in the traditional way? Maybe some was, but most wasn't. And even if it was, few will have heard about it because of the disparity in resources, one of which being the ability to project narrative. So these narratives aren't going to be refuted from the inside. They are refuted from the outside somehow. If they're wrong, they're shown to be wrong by something outside of the funhouse. Going into the funhouse and responding to every piece of evidence is a mug's game. And two, consider the fallout if a narrative is dropped. For the Iraq WMDs, there was some major fallout. Newspapers cheerleading the war, referring to incontrovertible evidence of such weapons. The legacies of Colin Powell and George Bush are forever tarnished by this falsity. And of course, things like the mobile weapons labs just look ridiculous in hindsight. And of course, this also calls into question U.S. aerial reconnaissance abilities to infer what's actually being produced inside buildings. The kind of inferences that they draw based on what they think is being shipped in and out. Maybe they've improved since then, or maybe they've gotten worse. And the fallout continues to dog those in the U.S. who want to dive into another horrible foreign misadventure. Individuals who commit to a narrative will have to eat crow if that narrative is wrong. Let's take an example involving me. I earnestly believed ivermectin was effective in a causal way at treating COVID. I was then exposed to some information that showed quite clearly that it was not causal and that ivermectin was actually good at treating a certain type of parasitic infection and thus showed efficacy in reducing mortality in populations that had a certain type of parasitic infection, and it was unrelated to actually dealing with the COVID variants. Now that's rough for me because I publicly committed to a narrative. And so there's an incentive for me to just lie and keep at it. Now, I'm one guy and my MO is not predicated on the effectiveness of ivermectin in treating COVID. But the point is the incentive was there. And it's not some incentive problem that I deliberately sought out. Like, I'm going to intentionally try to make myself biased by publicly committing to a narrative. That it's just a problem of reality itself. And when you publicly commit to a narrative, that raises the bar for the amount of evidence it will take for you to change your mind. And the problem gets worse because not only are you raising the bar, but you're finding ways to dismiss evidence as well. So you're raising the bar and tying ankle weights to anyone trying to get over it. And that's just for a single person, me, in a relatively, in something that I have not, that I didn't commit too hardly to. I made a video about it, you know, but it's not a really central thing. So it's fairly easy for me to sort of back off. The amount of crow that I have to eat is fairly low compared to the amount of crow someone like Powell and Bush would have to eat to say, yeah, we lied getting into this war and getting however many people killed as a result. Now add to this social problems, institutions. Let's just make up an example. Let's say like the tetanus shot doesn't actually work or something. This is just a hypothetical. I'm not saying that this is true. I'm just using it as an example. Say you find out that the tetanus shot doesn't actually work. And say you, an individual doctor, has learned of this. Okay, now what? Hospitals make a lot of money giving these shots. Vaccine companies make a lot of money as well, and lots of people have taken these shots. Doctors, you know, have endorsed these shots. So, you know, however long they've worked is sort of related to how many of these shots that they've given out to people who trusted them. Okay. Something becoming part of the institutional narrative could, on the one hand, be expected to make it more likely to be true if you believe there was due diligence that led to its adoption in the first place. But once something is in that kind of nexus of accepted beliefs, it's actually less likely to be true. That effect makes it less likely to be true because there are incentives to maintain things that are in the institutional nexus, true or false. So, and this is a kind of subtle point, but it's very important. Very important. So a thing being accepted by the institutional nexus is, on the one hand, more likely to be true if there was some due diligence that led to it being part of the institutional nexus. The more due diligence was done in vetting ideas that get into this nexus, the stronger this positive effect of the vetting. Once adopted, however, it will be defended to some extent if it's false. And the deeper embedded the belief is, the worse this negative effect is. That is the protection of false beliefs in the institutional nexus. So those are the two things you have going on. So we're talking about convergence of evidence from the institutional side of things. So the initial process of sifting, if done honestly and well, increases the likelihood of a thing being true. However, the status of something being in the institutional nexus, like if you just skipped any initial sifting process and just teleported a narrative into the institutional nexus, that makes it less likely to be true. Take a belief whose probability you think has a 50% chance of being true. It's 50-50. And let's say your probability evaluation is perfect, just for sake of this. If this belief wasn't vetted, but was just somehow teleported into the institutional nexus, for example, like a medical belief was just teleported into the institutional nexus, or a historical belief or something was just teleported in. You know, it was right in there with the polio vaccine and optimal rubber manufacturing in terms of depth into the institutional nexus. If it was just teleported in there, you should assign it a probability of being true of less than 50%, because now there are vested interests in this thing being true. Textbooks have been written saying it's true, teachers spent years saying it's true, companies made movies and even games saying it's true. All of this makes it resistant to criticism and thus less likely to actually be true, right? Because you have a belief that is unfairly protected, precisely because it is accepted within the institutional nexus. The status of being in a textbook per se makes something less likely to be true than if it were not. Now, perhaps there was a process by which something was vetted, and perhaps this process was done well. Now, when we start going into textbooks, maybe some skepticism on that. But if the vetting process is done well, perhaps things in textbooks are overall more likely to be true than things which are not. My personal opinion is that this is true. That if something is in a generally used textbook, that makes it more likely to be true. Warts and all. What I'm saying is that the status of something being in a textbook per se makes it less likely to be true. Because if something is in a textbook, it went through a vetting process. Some vetting process. If not, if it didn't, then it didn't. And this vetting process makes the thing in the textbook more likely to be true. However, if you were to just teleport something into the textbook without any vetting, then that thing is less likely to be true than if it were not teleported into that textbook. If it were just put on some non-authoritative source, like a blog, like just some guy's blog. An individual statement per se is more likely to be true if it's on someone's blog than if it's in a textbook, barring any of the benefit from a proper vetting, right? So, and I've experienced this effect, and later on I'll go into more examples evidencing this effect, that what I'm saying here is true, and that this distinction between the initial filtering to get something into a nexus and the negative effect of being in the nexus. But just for now, just like a personal story. I've experienced this effect on a small scale writing for the high school newspaper. I don't wish to share the content here, but I wrote something about the football team that ended up being false, even though I was on the football teams. That's another thing. I was there, man. How can you say I was wrong? I was there. I'm on the team. I'm in the locker room, man. My physical presence doesn't mean I'm in too deep and unable to see the bigger picture. It means I have the inside scoop. It makes me more aware because I'm there, man. Well, no, actually, it may make you less aware. But that's another thing for another time. Anyway, I said something wrong, and I was talking to, and I realized I was wrong after the paper got published. And I was talking to just some rando about it, and he repeated something that I wrote and cited my own article in front of me. And I told him that was wrong. And of course, since I told him I was the author and I disavowed that sort of ended his argument. But what happened there? What happened? I created a narrative which I genuinely believed. I wasn't lying, but I was wrong. Because like high school newspaper, it got printed without due diligence. It got teleported into a very small institutional nexus. But see, the thing I said was treated as more likely to be true because it was written in the school paper, right? Assumption of due diligence. The result was that it was more likely to be accepted and shielded against a certain amount of criticism because it was in the school paper. This thing I said was more accepted than it would be if it came from sort of the bottom up, right? If it came from the rumor mill. It was institutional, the school newspaper, but still an institution of some sort. This status makes it more likely to be believed, all else being equal or per se, than if it were not written in the newspaper. And that's a bad thing. That's a negative effect. It means false beliefs are more likely to persist if they're in some sort of institutional frame. The hope being that there was some vetting process that led to it getting into an institutional frame in the first place. Okay, which is to say, things that are actually false can more likely persist if they're nestled in the institutional nexus. And the more deeply nestled they are, the bigger the falsity that can persist. The hope is that due diligence was done on the front end to make sure things or for science, things that work, are all that get into the institutional nexus. And so what this boils down to is that faith in institutions is faith in the initial vetting process and nothing else. Okay? Because once it's in, it's less vetted. If the initial vetting process is crap, then what you have are basically teleported narratives. They just teleport in, whose status as authoritative actually makes them more likely to be wrong than if those same narratives were posted in a non-authoritative location. Because the same narrative posted in a non-authoritative location will face more skepticism than if posted in an authoritative location. And if, a narrative in a non-authoritative location is directly in conflict with an authoritative narrative, it's going to face an unreasonable level of skepticism. It's going to face the minutiae grinding sort of effect, sort of, prove each individual muscle cell sort of thing, sort of the funhouse opposition. And whether you're more interested in conspiracy blogs or authoritative sources on any given topic, it's a matter of how much you trust the initial vetting process that causes narratives to be transmuted from just a thing people say to authoritative. Right? How does it go from just being any other proposition to being authoritative? And that can vary a lot depending on what institutions you're talking about and what this filtering process is. Now, for history, quote unquote, in particular, what is the vetting process? I mean, there are virtually no experiments and no testing. They try to when they can sometimes. Sometimes there's a particular topic where there is a lot of investigation that could be done that isn't done. But so history is probably one of the worst in terms of having any kind of initial filter. So with the subject of history, that's where you're going to get the most of these propositions that are just teleported into the institutional nexus.